Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to see you back. If you are joining us again, and if you are someone who's never attended before, welcome to the Positioning Theory virtual series. As was noted in the uh, recording, you should have heard the voice that said we are recording today's presentation, so thank you for allowing us to record those. I am Mary McVie, and I'm hosting the Positioning Theory virtual series for this year with today we've got Bo Christensen and Luke Van Langenhove also here as well. And then we've got, of course, our presenters. So just a couple of quick announcements before we get underway with our talks. We do have some save the dates for the Positioning Theory virtual fall series, and those are the dates that we will be holding our Positioning Theory virtual talks on. We are still working on our slate of talks and working through those. We have some of them set and some of them are still to be announced, but those are the dates. So we will be sending those out as well, but you can reserve those dates if you are interested in putting those on the calendar. Just a couple of reminders, the Positioning Theory Handbook is out and it is available through Routledge. I also have some discount codes if you are interested in purchasing. The electronic copies are fairly reasonable. The hard print copies, as typical for presses, are a higher price, and they will, I think, issue these again as a paper copy in the future. But if you are interested in purchasing that, let me know and I can get a discount code for you. Just a quick announcement for folks who are co-authors or authors on handbook chapters. I am reaching out to Routledge again to find out why those have not been sent to you yet. So we'll keep working on that. I've been in touch with them multiple times and I had thought we had resolved that, but we will get those to you so you have your copies. Just a big thank you. I want to say shout out to Pasi Hirvonen and the University of Eastern Finland for hosting us this summer. We had a really great conference. Thank you for all of you who attended, presented, and were part of that community. And we had some great conversations, and I think some of those will be finding their way into our talks across the year as well. So thank you to Posse for hosting such a wonderful conference. Okay, without any further ado, I'm going to turn things over to today's presenters, and I will let the presenters introduce themselves and their talks, and we will be starting with the talk from Bo Christensen. So, Bo, I will stop sharing my slides and let you start sharing yours.
Thank you, Mary. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, you're good.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about positioning theory, speech acts, and normative authors, which is my chapter 3 in the handbook. My name is Bo. I'm from Aalborg University in Denmark, and one of the co-editors with Mary, Luke, and Cindy of this handbook. So a little bit of the background. I have a big interest, at least one of interest of mine is understanding the historical background of positioning theory, PT, I'm going to call it here, and especially the background or context of some of the central notions, for example, the idea of speech acts within PT. And the context I'm speaking about here is the British philosophy just after the Second World War, which is often called ordinary language philosophy, or as I will refer to it, OLP. And ordinary language philosophy means something like doing an inquiry or analysis aiming at understanding the complexity and diversity of natural language and meaning making in use. So I will concentrate mostly on the ordinary and the language parts and mostly leave out the philosophy part here. I think this is interesting for at least 3 things, and which I touch upon in the chapter as well. One of them is that OLP was dominated by philosophers like John Austin, Gilbert Ryle, and Peter Rawson, all of whom actually were Rom Haray's teachers in Oxford when he arrived there in the early 50s. And many people, many of you familiar with Rom's writings, would recognize these, what they call dons, as very significant discussion partners. There are some others as well, of course, but these are some of the really significant ones of them. So also, though they are part kind of like of the same historical context, they were very highly original thinkers and probably wouldn't consider themselves part of the same movement. So this is kind of like what we usually collect people together in a term, collect them together in a term like ordinary language philosophers, where actually they should probably be called natural language philosophers or something like that instead. Another thing I think is interesting of going back to the background is that the reason why ordinary language philosophy is important is because, and this is one of my claims, it forms part of Haray's notion of ethogenics, which, again, I would claim serves as a significant developmental step for positioning theory. I think this is indicated, I'll come back to that later, in, for example, the changes from the first to the second editions of Haray's book, Social Being, which the second edition is published at the same time as the first positioning theory articles actually appear. Also, I'm going to say a little bit about some of the general themes of ordinary language philosophy, particularly about what language and ordinary means. And this is basically that language is performative, and as social episodes in PT works a bit like the ordinary in ordinary language philosophy, they sensitize us to the context and the successful and unsuccessful conditions obtaining there. And I will furthermore spice this up a little bit by presenting some thoughts about Austin and what it means to promise as a speech act and say I do as well. So this will lead us on to, I think, another reason why exploring the history of positioning theory is important, because here we have some of the resources, I would claim, for dealing with some of the contemporary challenges. And in this case, I want to ask whether we shouldn't distinguish between normative and moral orders to avoid the confusion that everything we do has a moral background and moral implications. But more on that later. So let me first start out by esothenetics. In what has become kind of like a classic of recent psychology, Rom Haray and Paul Secord did this book in the beginning of the 70s, I think, The Explanation of Social Behavior, where they criticized the predominant, very much experimental social psychology because it was based on what they called crude empiricist premises. And these crude empiricist premises was conceiving people's main way of interacting with the world through causal relations, and people as understood as passive responding to stimuli and not as active engaged beings. So the whole aspect of normativity, that our actions and psychological processes are guided by norms and values, was wrongly bypassed according to Haray and Secord. So instead, they propose some sort of post-experimental psychology, which is ethogenics instead. So this ethogenic approach can be described as a socio-psychological approach aimed at understanding how individuals attach meaning to the actions and process of identification by drawing on rules and other symbolic means dispersed in the wider sociocultural sphere of society. The meaningfulness of people's cognitive and emotional lives is understood as relying on the conversations going on around them, some of which they participate in directly, whereas some of those are interpreted from a distance. So these conversations are then used idiosyncratically by people in the acts of meaning giving, thereby transforming people from similar individuals into specific persons or characters. Hence, being a dad is a notion referring to very many individuals, but how being a dad is enacted depends on each individual's personalizing the sociocultural resources and the conversations available for this person for being a dad. So, approaching this ethogenics, the idea was that one could combine some sort of combining ordinary language philosophy with the everyday sociology of Goffman and Garfinkel. And here's Hare's claims about that. He says, ethnogenetics as combining OLP and microsociology, and as the main psychological technique in ethnogenetics is the analysis of the speech of participants in social life. The very detailed and often extremely subtle analysis of ordinary language made by Oxford School of Philosophers and others in the linguistic tradition can be employed, in the course of which are revealed the theories implicit in ordinary speech. These two developments, the one in microsociology and the other in language analysis, contribute an enormous but previously untapped resource. So I think we can already see here that there's a connection between the analysis of speech and some sort of notion of orderliness of our interactions taking place as an object for doing analysis. But then again, what has all this got to do with positioning theory? Well, Hare worked with this perspective through the 70s, which is also serving as a background for his 1979 book called Social Being. So, which was part of the Social Being trilogy. So, around the same time as the article containing the previous quote, just before, Hare published the first edition of his book, Social Being. Together with his two other books, Personal Being and Physical Being, published in the beginning of the 80s, this trilogy of explorations into the human being was to present an overall investigation using ethnogenetics and hence the aforementioned two approaches in combination. What is interesting in relation to my chapter for the handbook is the second edition of The Social Being, published in 1993 and coinciding with the development of positioning theory in the early 90s. In this second edition, Hare incorporated a whole section, which is actually part 2, called Methods for the Social Psychology, I think it's page 94 following, where he used and described PT as if it were a natural extension or supplement to the formal project of exploring social, personal, and physical being. He claimed that what has become increasingly prevalent, both through the exploration of historyology, but also by many other scholars during the 80s, by, for example, John Shutter, King Gergen, Jonathan Potter, Margaret Redwell, to name a few, was the fruitful insights of the discursive turn in psychology. So at the time of the second edition, Hare therefore wrote, "It now seems right to incorporate some of these insights into a new edition of Social Being, fitted it in hindsight for its role in the wider study." Hence, OLP and its subtle way of doing analysis was considered part of this. And let me give you some of the influence I can see on this, on ethnogenetics, and then implicitly on PT as well. So the first thing to consider is there's a movement from formal to analysis of natural language in a certain sense. So if we take up the formal analysis first, the idea here was, so overall in the philosophy of language and some of the linguistics as well, that in the beginning of the 20th century, the idea was to analyze different domains of everyday language, and by using formalized language, as in logic or in mathematics, of, for example, Gottlob Frege, show how to dispense with some of its vagueness, everyday language vagueness, and how certain sentences, while not directly referring to something, might nevertheless be considered meaningful. They were meaningful because they contributed to the sentence in which they were part of. The subsequent philosophy of language, all of the ordinary language philosophers, stressed 2 points against this formal analysis of language. First of all, it fails to contextualize language, and it fails to show that language is used by concrete persons interacting, and often without any trouble understanding ambiguities. Second, it presupposes language some sort of neutral representation or description of the world. But by turning our attention to the ordinary use of language, we see language as predominantly performative in natural and ordinary settings of use. For example, in an early article, Austin presented this as a constative versus a performative understanding of language. And he meant that the constative, what would be a predominant descriptive way of understanding the relation between language and the world, was a specific part of the performativity of language also here. But what is meant by language and ordinary here? If we turn towards the ordinary, Ryle claimed in one of his articles that the edges of ordinary is blurred. He meant by that we should not contrast ordinary with something extraordinary or esoteric. Even practices and specialist vocabularies within abstract math or nuclear physics contain words and distinctions used in an ordinary, that is right and wrong, way by the practitioners. Hence, the ordinary can be common and shared for some people, but can be uncommon for others. So Ryle said there's no sharp boundary between common and uncommon, technical and untechnical, old-fashioned and current, or clear and ambiguous. The ordinary is not to be seen as some sort of repository of meaning we can appeal to for solving any communicative challenges we face once and for all. While it, of course, can function as a source we can draw upon to make the encounters we have meaningful in different situations, it should not blind us to the fact that it is just as much a source of failure. Our articulated dealings with each other often misfire, words are taken the wrong way, and sentences are often very misunderstood. Hence, our doings and sayings are both felicitous and infelicitous, as Austin would say. If we turn to language, it is not just used, it does something. One can ask, must we mean what we say? And answer, no. Sometimes we mean a lot more, and sometimes we mean a lot less. So the performative character comes out in what is expressed, how it is understood, and what happens afterwards. And language comprises here both linguistic and non-linguistic means of communication. So, for example, when I say I promise, I'm not making a statement describing some state of affair. According to Austin, I'm actually doing something. I'm namely committing to something by promising. But the same applies if I'm actually being asked, do you promise? And instead of saying yes, I just nod. Because nodding, by this nodding, I also do something. It is also a performative utterance, committing to whatever is promised. Speech acting, therefore, involves an embodied stance as well, and not just the vocalization. And if we look into Austin's how to do things with words, there's a ton of examples of gestures and stuff like that. Now, one can wonder what the relation is between the promise and its future fulfillment or not. Is this a causal relation? So the promise function as a cause and the keeping of it or not is the reaction. Not according to Austin. This is more of a normative and not a causal relation, as you will see on the next slide. So note here also, this is there's a similarity to Harry and Secort's arguments against the crude empiricism we addressed above. And here we also, I think, approach as one, like I said in the beginning, one of the examples of contemporary relevance. So referring to the act of promising, Austin writes, we do not mean by that such and such a future event is or will be brought about as an effect of this action function as a cause. We mean rather that in consequence of the performance of this act, such and such a future event, if it happens, will be in order, and such other events, if they happen, will not be in order. The notion of order is obviously central in this quote. And this order, I think, is very similar to positioning theory's notion of moral order. Since the meaning of the utterance of promise is positioning oneself as keeping the promise, this presupposes what in positioning theory is a particular moral order. Similar in Austin, where the performative aspect of a given speech act is tied to the ordered behavior following the locutionary and perlocutionary consequences of it. Similarly, it's only an ordained priest who has the right to carry out a wedding ceremony. and only the bride and the groom commit themselves by saying "I do." A wedding ceremony performed in a movie is not continued beyond the movie, and someone asking a 5-year-old if she or he wants ice cream after a wedding ceremony will, in normal circumstances, not understand the anticipated "I do" as involving the same order as the "I do" of the newlyweds. Hence, we might also ask whether both instances, the "I do" of the 5-year-old and the married couple, count as moral. The newlyweds are, of course, morally obliged to each other in new ways, both legally, socially, and personally, after the "I do." The promise of ice cream is, however, I think, not inherently moral as the newlyweds. Providing ice cream can just as easily be understood as giving a reward to the child for sitting through the ceremony. Hence, it is a commitment limited in time and space, unlike the commitment of the newlyweds. Here, it would rather be something given in exchange for good behavior and not something you commit to as an expression of values. Furthermore, upon failure to deliver the ice cream, if not available, the reward could probably be replaced by sweets. This probably makes the promise of ice cream a case of a normative order of rewarding and less of a moral order. Some would even say that rewarding like this are immoral. Hence, my interpretation of Austin seems to make room for a distinction between normativity as the orderliness tied to speech acts in general, and the moral character of certain speech acts tied to their performance in particular moral orders. And I think in this way we could avoid collapsing the moral and the normative, which is sometimes confusing, and thereby also resist understanding every act we do as ethical or moral. So we might sum this up as saying that while all acts are normative, only some acts are moral. So let's say it this way, that "I do" points towards different kind of orders, not necessarily moral. And hence we should distinguish between these normative and moral orders and use the last part, moral orders, for those normative situations which deal explicitly with more social episodes. So my suggestion here is not meant as replacing one overall term, moral orders, with another, namely normative orders. It is merely meant to suggest that all interactions or speech acting as such are guided by norms, though not all of them are moral norms, and that they are thus orderly or aiming to be, and this takes place in many different ways depending on the situation or the social episode. So the distinction aims at enhancing our sensitivity as positioning theory scholars towards the different kinds of ways norms are expressed and drawn upon in different kind of contexts. Actually, I think Hooray in one of the summing up articles of positioning theory from 2009, I think Hooray and his all the co-authors seems to indicate some of the same thing, because speaking about rights and duties connected with positions, they claim these are shorthand terms for clusters of moral normative presuppositions which people believe or are told or slip into, and to which they are momentarily bound in what they say and do. Hence, what is meant by moral here is the normative dimension of these orders, not particular instances of these orders being moral or ethical. And so to wrap things up a little, in my chapter, I point towards some of those, other influences from OLP. And this is, as you can see here, the final table of my chapter showing some of the trajectories from the ordinary language philosophy being picked up by the frame of ethogenics. And as you can see, there are both Austin, Ryle, Strawson, but there's also some stuff from Goffman and Garfin going into this as well. And I think through this ethogenics, it's informing the development of positioning theory as well. So not all of these are explicit, and some of them kind of like have some tensions built in between them, which are unresolved. But I think it's very important to be aware of this, because some of the challenges with positioning theory, which we often discuss, I think we actually already have the conceptual resources to deal with if we go back and look at the history, as I have hinted at here. I've mentioned normativity, but another one could be the speech and other acts, because already Austin speaks about gesticulation and even signs as having performative meaning. And Strawson and the whole ordinary language philosophy part speaks about embodiment as part of the personhood of people, of making up their identity as well. Not many people know that they were reading Merleau-Ponty in the 50s at this point as well, and this informed their ideas about this as well. So this was the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo, for that talk. So if you're, we will follow the same structure that we've followed in the past, which is that we will go on to the second talk, but please be, you can write comments or questions into the chat if you wish to keep those, or jot them down on paper or computer, however you want to recall them. And then we'll take questions across both talks and talk question and discussion across both talks at the end. So thank you again, Bo. And at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Beth. I see your slideshow on the screen, and now it's up full size, so I think you're good to go.
Good morning. Thanks, Mary and others for their time and commitment organizing this series. And I'd like to thank all the participants for coming to have conversations around the book chapter. I'm here today with my colleagues. I'm Beth Herbel-Eisenmann, and I'm here with my colleagues, David Wagner and Hilja Huru. And our chapter is co-authored also with Anita, Simensen, and Annica Andersson, who weren't able to join us today. The chapter itself focuses on the context of mathematics education. It's a combination of a lit review and a theorizing chapter to think about what positioning as praxis might entail, what kind of commitments. So just very briefly, I'm going to tell a little bit about how we came to this book chapter. We'll give an overview of what we mean by praxis, lay out some commitments or imperatives that we think are important if one uses positioning as praxis, and then end with some questions. So in about 2005, Dave and I started reading the positioning theory book after an editor of another book told me I couldn't just keep using the word position as a verb and not say what I meant by it. Shortly thereafter, I had 2 long-term collaborations with teacher researchers in 2 different states and co-designed professional development materials for secondary math teachers using positioning. Dave, Annica, and I then came together during a conference in Arizona where we spent time hiking and talking about projects we'd love to work on together. Those conversations have led to 2 funded grant proposals, one through the Research Council in Norway and one through the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council of Canada, both focused on math education, Indigenous and migration contexts, storylines, and strength-based pedagogies. So over time, we've been fortunate to have a bigger team of collaborators, authors of the chapters and of this chapter included, that have diverse perspectives and experiences. And important to all of our collaborations are theories of positioning and a commitment to praxis. As we read and use these theories related to positioning, however, we've seen missing aspects of participatory sensibilities that we think relate well to the theorizing of positioning.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to the people in Europe and places in line with Europe. What is praxis? The word comes from a Greek word for action. You may have heard scholars talk about theory and practice in tension with each other. Scholarly work on praxis connects theory and practice. Key figures developing the idea of praxis include Maxine Green, who described praxis as the capacity to look at things as if they could be otherwise, and Paulo Freire, who focused on action and reflection. For both of them, praxis is transformative action. Allesøe is not as famous as Green and Freire, but explains that epistemology is an important aspect of transformative action because it requires perception, recognition, and connection making. As a scholar, I see these as action too, perceiving, recognizing, and linking. But I also recognize that perception or conceptualization is different when it is done within empirical work as compared to theory work abstracted from empirical analysis. Beth and I said this in the positioning symposium in Bruges in our comments on positioning theory. And now we are saying that conceptualization is different yet when it is done in a context of working together for change. Working for change together with the people most impacted by the change is the heart of participatory research. And we see the imperative of doing positioning research by paying attention to the voices of the people most impacted by the positioning and the relationships. We find the theorization of positioning to be a strong basis for this kind of participatory work. Over the years that we have worked with positioning, we have increasingly recognized feminist roots in the theory. For example, we have often quoted the seminal article by Bronwyn Davies and Ram Hare from 1990. Davies is and has been an influential feminist scholar. We acknowledge that some of the work developing or using positioning theory is not very feminist and not as conducive to social transformation, but we are energized by the feminist stance. For us, a key aspect of positioning, as developed by Davies and Hare, is the contestability of positioning and of storylines. It is important to us that people in an interaction can have different ideas of what storylines are in play or should be in play, and the people can have different ideas of what positions they play or should play in the interaction. Another key aspect of positioning is the focus on immanence. The line from Davies and Hare that has caught us is where they said, "La langue is an intellectualizing myth, only la parole is psychologically and socially real." We noted that the storylines, the myths, la langue, these things, they do exist, but only as they are mediated through the people in an interaction. And this recognition helps us to see that people can contest and transform the storylines and positioning that others imagine for them. We wish to see mathematics students who recognize the power they have to shape their interaction, the power they have to shape their action, especially students who identify with groups that have been marginalized historically. And we also wish for teachers to recognize their students' experiences, their students' knowledges, and their students' power. This is why we do participatory research. We reviewed articles in mathematics education that use theorizations of positioning with an eye for seeing implications for using this theory for praxis. And this is the fundamental basis of our chapter. From our read, we distilled 5 commitments for action. These are actions we commit to in our work and that we promote for others who want to engage in transformational participatory research working with the theorization of positioning. They're not easy to commit to, but they're ones we commit to. And we wrote them as imperatives, as commands. They are historicize the situation, reflect on our positionality as researchers, foreground the perspectives of the people who are participant in the interactions we research and honor those perspectives. Tensions will be inevitable, especially if the context is one that sees some people groups historically marginalized. Address those tensions with humility and transparency. And finally, acknowledge the hopes and fears of the participants in the research. We will talk about 3 of these imperatives today. Of course, you can read our chapter for more detail, especially on the other 2 imperatives. Beth.
Thanks, Dave. So the second imperative is reflect on positionality. And we draw on Haraway's work and emphasize that this kind of reflection requires us to understand our location, embodiment, and perspective, because our positions are always partial, locatable, and critical. We also highlight in the chapter that reflexivity must be central to this kind of work because it helps us understand how our biases, values, and experiences shape the ongoing work that we do. In the math ed literature then, we see glimpses of this in the work using positionings. We also want to highlight that we know that the work that the majority of it was not done for the purpose of Praxis, but we sort of looked within the articles for glimpses of these commitments happening. So there were at least 4 ways people have started to engage with positionality. One is just giving brief identity statements. Another one is paragraphs that situated the author's experiences, learnings, and identities, and these tended to be mostly in contexts where people were working with Indigenous or First Nations populations. Another way that people recognize their positionality was within the context of their methods or methodology. For example, Solomon noted that the interviews that they were doing were really joint constructions. They weren't just objective data being gathered from participants. And then the 4th way was locating oneself within a paradigm and then acknowledging how that relates to subjectivities and interpretations. So in this case, Wood connected the fact that she was drawing on interpretivist theories to really write about her subjectivities as a white middle-class woman who was also an elementary math educator. So there were at least 4 different ways that people acknowledged sort of starting points for positionality, yet not to the extent that qualitative research methodologies and Praxis require. We encourage people doing this kind of work to look at articles like the one authored by Dr. Rich Milner that provides questions that we can ask about the seen, unseen, and unforeseen related to race and culture. The next imperative dovetails nicely with this one in that we foreground and honor participant perspectives. Honoring participant perspectives, especially those who have been most negatively impacted by racist, sexist, and colonizing policies and practices, goes well with positioning's claim that people are free to contest power structures around them. We agree with a piece on the participatory turn by Oshibodu and colleagues that when historicizing, which is the first imperative, it's important not to center canonical interpretations and tellings, which are often told from dominant or colonizing perspectives. We suggest that the people in a research context together need to decide, as a collaboration, the most appropriate approach. When we look at math ed research, we again see glimpses of this happening. We see examples of participant voices being lifted up in the transcripts that are provided. There are authors that include sociometric data to get students' perspectives related to the social dynamics of a classroom. We see scholars providing a multi-layered analytic frame to interpret the data. And we see co-constructing findings with teachers. However, we did not find any examples of co-constructing findings with youth, but there were instances, for example, of authors sharing field notes and asking for reflections, or having students reflect on videos of their own contributions. There was also one example of a long-term collaboration wherein a group of teacher researchers and a university researcher partnered over a long period of time, drawing on positioning theory to negotiate classroom discourse with students that affirm their identities and tried to support them to develop positive mathematics identities. And back to Dave.
Yes, thank you, Beth. The 5th imperative we wrote about is to acknowledge the hopes and fears of the participants in the research. This commitment to action is rooted in some statements of hope we saw in some of the articles we read. However, those statements of hope were really the hopes of the researchers. We might say that they were hopes that the researchers had for their participants or for others who are like their participants, in our case, hopes for mathematics students. But that's different than seeing what their hopes are themselves. For true participatory work, we argue for attention to the hopes of the participants. Of course, we are participants too in an interaction, but we have positions of power and privilege as researchers. The most important hopes are the hopes of the participants who are most impacted in the context we are researching. And we are especially interested in the hopes of the people who identify with groups that have been marginalized historically because their hopes tend to be ignored. Eve Tuck is an Indigenous scholar who wrote about desires in her letter to educational researchers and practitioners concerned with fostering and maintaining ethical relationships with disenfranchised and dispossessed communities, and all of those troubled by the possible hidden costs of a research strategy that frames entire communities as depleted. She promoted a desire-based framework to replace frameworks that position people and people groups as broken. So we see hope and fear as two sides of the same coin. They're intertwined. So we encourage attention to both. Following Tuck's lead, I think anyway, we see that any fear might be rewritten as a hope, and also vice versa. We increasingly are seeing that storylines are underwritten by hopes and fears. There's a hope or a fear that motivates the action in any storyline. Thus, to transform the storylines or positions available to students, which is our goal, we should be attentive to those foundations of the storylines, the hopes and the fears. We thank you for your attention to this quick overview of our chapter in this exciting handbook, and we look forward to dialogue with you shortly. And of course, you can email us with questions later. We want to close our presentation with questions that we are still grappling with. You may want to engage with these questions in the dialogue that follows our presentation, but of course, we are open to other questions too. One is, for the communities and context we research, whose perspectives dominate? Whose perspectives warrant attention in those communities? Another, researching complex relationships, for example, in a school classroom, how can we foreground the voices we are most interested in? For example, the schools, they have a complex relationships because of the power differentials between the roles, but also even within the roles. Students relate to their teachers in their power relationships, but the students also relate to other students in their power relationships. We have said we want to foreground the voices of the groups who have been ignored historically, but to access the schools, we have to secure permission and openness from the people with the most power in those contexts. That's the importance of the gatekeepers. And finally, how can we lead diverse stakeholders to develop desire or strength-based actions or pedagogy? In other words, how do we move from identifying storylines to transforming them? Or how do we mediate the relationships in our complex research contexts, considering that the people in those places have a range of openness to new possibilities? So those are not exactly the same questions we closed the chapter with. They're the questions that we have now after planning this presentation and also with the evolution of our work together in our research context. But let me just check with Hilja and Beth to see if they have any questions they want to add, perhaps a question that emerged during our presentation. By the way, Hilja is present here, but she wasn't able to connect with us when we were planning this, so she didn't have an active role in presenting, but she's here. Are there others to add, Hilja or Beth?
I don't have
It might-
others. Hilja,
No.
do you?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, it might come up in dialogue. So thank you all, and we look forward to the dialogue together.
Thank you so much for that wonderful overview of your chapter. If it's relatively easy to do, you could put your questions that you ended with too into the chat, just so that people could look over them again and revoice them if they would like to. So again, for folks who have a question, there are several ways we can ask a question or make a comment. So comments are also welcome. You can put your comment or your question in the chat. You can use the virtual raise hand feature to raise a hand so that we call on you. If you're comfortable doing so, you can unmute yourself and turn on your video and ask your question. So there are numerous ways to do this. So thank you, David, for putting those questions into the chat. I see that Luke has put, and I'm not sure if Luke is here anymore because I know he had to leave early today, but I saw that he put a comment for Bo. And again, we'll talk across both of these talks. So any comments or questions that you have on either talk, we're welcome to. As well as responding to any of the comments or questions that other folks have. So the question to Bo says, on the difference between normative and moral order, I think the difference is that a normative order is specific in the sense that there is a rule on what to do or not to do. For instance, the prohibition of smoking in public spaces. I see a moral order as more than just one rule that is followed or not. For instance, when one person says, I love you to another who replies, I love you too, then a new moral order is created that makes some behavior accepted that would be morally judged in a different way if the two would be in, for instance, a best friend's moral order. So that's the comment from Luke. Bo, do you want to respond to that?
Not really.
Okay, let me put it this way. I'm going to use a little forced positioning. Now, Bo will respond to Luke's comment.
No, not really, because I'm not sure exactly what Luke is meaning by this. My point was merely like most of you probably have talked with your student as well. Why do you call this moral orders? What does this have to do with anything moral or ethical or something like that? Whereas my point was merely that, well, there's some sort of, Luke speaks about rules. I'm not that much fond about rule, but rule governance or norm governance or something like that. And I think the notion of normativity captures this much better also in a dynamic way, because you can challenge it in a certain sense as well. So that was merely my point of doing that, also sensitizing us, instead of trying to kind of like trying to make theories about moral orders, then always like Beth and David speaks about, always paid attention to who's participating in within this concrete interaction, and try to bring out what are the kinds of orderliness in play dynamically here as well. So, but we all know, and Luke is not here, but Luke is very fond of Searle, which I'm not, because Searle has this idea of creating a theory of different kind of speech acts, which we can then teach to our students and then subsume that on the different, whenever they meet a speech act situation and stuff like that. To me, that's going the different way about. I think that's top-down approach, whereas my point was merely to say we can sensitize us towards these different kind of contexts by using normativity in a very broad sense, and thereby creating a much more bottom-up approach, which I also think David and Beth, in a certain sense, wants to kind of like address by the focus on the participants in this, their voices as well in these kind of situations as well.
David, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. It's a response to Luke's question that is inspired by Bo's response for non-response. I would wonder, like, he's asking for a distinction between normative and moral orders, and I would wonder, what doesn't normative imply a morality? I don't really see how normative can be made distinct from morality.
No, I was to put the other way around, that morality is one way of conceiving of normativity.
Yeah.
Like saying that all acts are normative, but not all acts are moral.
Maria, do you want to, I see you're putting a comment in about wondering about the relationship of normativity and moral orders and how we think about equity and justice. Do you want to jump into this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I totally, I kind of agree very much with your point about the relationship between normativity and morality. And I'm thinking the same way, that morality is a form of normativity, but not the other way around. But when we are thinking about equity and justice perspectives. I mean, Beth's and David's kind of presentation in terms of mathematics education and the kind of commitments we make to this kind of strengths pedagogies. I feel like there is kind of an entanglement between normativity and morality there. So there's an aspect of, harming or not harming people, which I really associate with morality. So I wonder really how we think as community about that intersectional spaces between normativity and morality.
Can I respond? I think that's an interesting question, right? And I think it's interesting that David and Beth bring up Paulo Freire as well, because that makes me think about whether the notion of right and duties is not too particularly European way of conceiving about normativity, and especially about justice and equity as well. So when we move to other cultures, there might be other ways of thinking about normativity, which should be brought into play as well. And I think Paulo Freire is one who's actually very much sensitizing us to pick up those kind of questions and say, okay, in these kind of situations, what kind of normativity is in play here? And is it different than a very typical European way of thinking about rights and duties in a certain sense? And I'm thinking about Africa as well. That could be very interesting to actually pick up some positioning scholars from there as well to talk about that as well. So I tend to think about right and duties as one specific way of thinking about normativity, which Rom has played out. And I think Bronwyn and David and Beth try to open up this normativity question towards different ways of thinking about right and wrong as well.
I wonder, David and Beth, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm curious too, if you've just based on, some of the comments that Maria and Bo were making, and also David's earlier comments, if there are elements that you saw across the pieces that you reviewed, or maybe in your own work too, as you're looking at working with the indigenous populations and thinking about how do we also sometimes we don't realize that we are restricted or bounded by our own perspectives, because those are the ones that are invisible to us. So, I think Bo's example of rights and duties is a good example of how we might just be like, oh yeah, of course, rights and duties, but that is not the way that this would be conceived of in all cultures or settings. So I don't know if you have comments to add on that, or from either things you reviewed or your own work.
Actually, Hilya, I'm wondering if you have an example, given some of the pieces that you've been focusing on about invisibility. And it's okay to say not, but
Yeah, no, I'm not sure exactly how to relate. I have to think a little bit, Mary. Sorry about that, but yeah. But I see your point, but some examples is I don't have from the top of my head right now.
I can give an example, maybe.
Go ahead, David.
It wasn't really in the context of talking about positioning, though. I was talking with a colleague, a scholar from Sub-Saharan Africa, and so I really appreciate, Bo, your question about the other cultures, or your comment about that. So talking with him, Kwesi Yarrow is his name, and his graduate students who are from Sub-Saharan Africa. And I told them about something that I heard a number of times when I lived in Sub-Saharan Africa, and they all laughed and with recognition, having heard that too. And then they started talking about what it meant, and it turned out that they all thought it meant different things, and similar related things, but on the so what struck me is that and it's not necessarily exactly an African perspective, but there are things that are said in cultures, even wide cultures, where people might even think that there's a certain normativity that goes with it, but that can vary considerably. And I don't know, it doesn't really exactly answer, but it was a very interesting conversation, which I'm not going to describe in great detail because it's so complex.
Thank you. I think that also builds into a comment that Ellen has put into the chat, where she's written, what Bo says I think is true. I've been living in Japan and teaching sociology, and students got confused about the difference between norms and moral values at times as a society is collectivist. So there may be another example of that. And Ellen, I don't know if you want to say any more about that or if you feel comfortable sharing any more about that, but please, feel free to do so if you would like to say something about that. So, and I think,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
I've got to allow something. I was interested in learner autonomy because I've been teaching English, and what the MA project I did was about autonomy and moral education, and I came across a moral education textbook which shows rabbits picking the flowers, and this is an example of something that shouldn't be done. It's in the moral textbook. It's wrong to pick the flowers in the park because you would spoil the park for other people. And so that's an example where the norm is kind of taken as a morality, I think. And I suppose there would be things like life and death situations which would be perceived as moral. But I was teaching with a sociology teacher from Europe, and in the end he actually just backed away from giving them a definition of how morality was different from norms, or how, I think it was in the context of values, and he just left it completely ambiguous, which might be because he was respecting a cultural ambiguity. Whereas I had felt that it would be very important to give a definition. But and I feel my attitude to morality strongly from being raised in a Christian culture.
Which also speaks to, I think, again, that there's been a number of conversations over time about that the problematic nature of the word moral in English, but also, as I understand it from talking with others, how it can also be translated into other languages as well, and the baggage that comes with that. Beth, were you going to say something?
I was just, I was looking at Maria's next comment in, because I mean, speaking from the US context and the way schools historically in the US were set up basically to promote white middle class, upper middle class as children's to become the leaders of the country. And a lot of the norms in schools are shaped by white middle class and upper middle class. And instead of critiquing that normativity, oftentimes what happens is children who don't fit into that get, I'll say, demonized or deficit framed. Yet the normativity, because it's become such part of the structure, is sometimes hard to disrupt or change, because seeing what people do, it's like, I go to school, this is what I do, instead of really like reimagining what the structure of schooling could look like. So to me, schools in and of themselves are an example of where normativity and sometimes morality are in direct conflict because of who's been allowed to shape the systems and structures that exist. And it's true at the university too. We all function in cis hetero patriarchal colonizing systems and structures. So I think that's another I don't know if that directly addresses your point, Maria, or not, but that's what I was thinking of as this conversation's been going on.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that a lot. So, and I think it relates to my question really of actions. I mean, I was intrigued by both in your presentation in terms of how we think about action in relation to normativity and morality, right? So what's the role of action? And we can be thinking about morality in conflict with normativity in US schools, absolutely. And then what's the role of action that's probably stimulated and motivated by morality to change the normativity or to, to push against, to resist, to start interrogating whatever all those things that we do to change a system which has been in place for a particular reason, right? You mentioned colonization, right? I mean, the systems are not are designed with a purpose by the designers. And that's where I think issues of normativity and morality come in place, because you design them with some moral value-laden kind of ways that you want the system to function. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
David alerted me that Susan has had her hand up for a while and I didn't see it. So Susan, do you want to share your comment or question?
Thank you. I find this distinction that you brought to our attention between morality and normativity really interesting in the conversation. One thing that occurs to me, well, I mean, I guess I sort of think of normativity as potentially arbitrary, that there are these arbitrary dimensions of culture that just happen to be the way that they are. But also, certainly with educational enterprises, there's always a moral charge implicit in the work, so that there are moral dimensions and there are, just happenstance dimensions. But nonetheless, this is the way that things have been set up to operate within a certain cultural context. And I just wanted to note that in this particular moment in the US, this post-truth moment where we have enormous disruptive forces looking to destabilize any sense of normativity in order to be, install authoritarian government, that there's a moral charge just committing to the normativity of the existing cultural framework. And that, like within schools, for instance, you have to work the system as in place in order to move in a more moral direction, so that there's this, I mean, it's like something we would all take for granted if we didn't have people completely acting out of absurdist, premises. We've got this thing going now with the vice presidential candidate, saying, yes, I made the story up. And whatever damage it's doing, it has brought attention to something important. And so there's a certain truth about it. And, it's just, so anyway, just that sort of base level commitment to norms has a moral dimension, is all I'm suggesting.
Yeah, if it's okay, Susan, I think I'm more jaded than you. I don't think I don't think a lot of these systems and structures are arbitrary. I think when they were established that they were intentional in some cases, but then have become such a part of the way we interact that people from dominant backgrounds forget to question them. Because I think, so Dave and Annica and I did a working group that at an international conference that focused on available. What does it mean that the phrase available storylines or available positionings is a phrasing sometimes? So we asked people to share examples, and every single person in the room shared an example of when a storyline or positioning became apparent, and every single example was a situation where they were not the dominant identity in the group. So women were sharing sexist and patriarchal and misogynistic examples. The conference was in India. People from lower caste were sharing examples, always from being in a lower caste experience. So I think they become so normalized, like you're saying, that we forget that somebody intentionally set up things, for example, Jim Crow laws in the United States to keep people in a certain place that are anti-Black and racist. So I don't know that I think you used the word
I don't mean to be misunderstood. I wasn't suggesting that the oppressive forces are arbitrary. I'm just saying that there are aspects to cultural frameworks that are just, the way they happen to be because they've grown up in a certain way on a certain land with certain people and certain forces. But in terms of the oppressive forces in schools, no, I certainly don't mean to suggest that there's anything arbitrary about it.
Thank you. And it's okay if you don't agree with me too.
No, but I most certainly do on that point. I mean, we've got the history to demonstrate it. That work's been done.
David, you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about some of these basic ideas within the theorization of positioning and the idea of the immanence again and the contestability. I'm thinking about how, like, if I'm in interaction with one of you or someone else, we have the option. I mean, we can take a stance on seeing a storyline as being arbitrary or normative or moral. It's to say that it's arbitrary, I guess, would be to say that this is what's often done in this situation. Let's not do that. Let's try something different. And but if we see it as moral, then it feels like there's some kind of force outside that's saying, no, we can't change this one because of God or because of whatever. And I think maybe that's a difference and we have an opportunity at any time to challenge the orders that are behind our interactions. Though I just remind us that some people see that opportunity better than others and have that opportunity better than others because of their privileges. But it even from a position of not having privilege, at least you can see things differently if you have experiences that give you the availability of those storylines to see things differently.
We probably have time for one more comment or question if folks do have a final question or thought to share. If not, I think we'll leave things here. This has really been an interesting conversation. I think that some of the things that both of these talks have tapped into today are some of those issues that cause some of us some wrestling, some questioning, some consternation, some wonderings about as we try to take a theory and apply it or write through it and think about it in different ways. So I really appreciate the conversation, the questions that folks have shared. Thank you so much for being here today. And we will see you in about a month's time. We'll be sending out that information as well. So thanks to our handbook authors, thanks to our presenters, and for all of you for helping the positioning community try to sort some of these issues out. We appreciate it. Thank you.